In stories that begin once upon a time in a land far away, we don't expect this story to have ever happened, and we don't expect that these characters have ever existed. They're too larger than life. They're too definable. But as we move closer over time to the invention of the genre of realism, we now start having characters that we recognize. They seem like they could actually live in the real world. They are not, but the conventions are developed to make them seem that way. So there are two main roads that writers went down to get to this. And the first one is the subject of this webinar, and it's the road of personal history. The assumption here is that things happen to a character that make that character. We don't make that assumption in romance. The character was just born that way. But in realism, we're assuming that the past is connected to the present, that the shape of the character results from the things that have happened to him or her and what the responses were. Often the way we think that in real life, that's how we're formed. It may be that we are or we aren't, but we have a certain way of looking at it. The idea that everyone has a story, you've probably heard that before, is that just ordinary people can have an interesting story that reveals something about how life is lived. Now this road led to a number of new discoveries of subgenres. For example, autobiography, which is the story that you tell about yourself, and biography, which would be a story that you would tell about somebody else. And these kinds of stories require the assumption that whatever happened to you or someone else resulted in who you became. You wouldn't write a biography about a romance hero because that would not be relevant. Another spin-off subgenre was memoir, where you're basically telling the story about how a society changed over time from your own personal perspective. You're looking at turning points in life, whether this is real or fictional. It is a shift from how we read romance. Other subgenres that were invented as a result of this shift in how we looked at a story is the Bildungsroman. And this is a coming-of-age story, that how a young person grows up to be a mature adult. Or the Künstlerroman, which is the development of an artist, that someone goes from being a young person, grows into being an artist, and this is the story of how that happens. This is all a result of a fascination with connecting the past to the present. And you might remember we witnessed this growing fascination when we were looking at the invention of history, that we have come to expect explanations for things that happen in the world that arise from what came before. In a romance, there just could be a black swan event that your enemy is going to come and attack you when your enemy attacks you, because that's what enemies do. But in history, like someone writing a book about the Second World War, as there have been many books and many stories, the assumption is that you can see how it started and explain why it happened because of things that went on before. And in realism, there is a fictional explanation of how a character became who the character was because of these turning points in his or her life. Now, what are these turning points? Well, they tend to be challenges to the kind of illusions of a romance character. Another way of looking at it is they function as a reality check. A young person growing up has illusions about who he or she wants to be or what life is like. And someone who misperceives reality a little bit that way is going to get punched in the face, as they say, and you have to get rid of your illusions, shake your head, get real, and understand life more specifically for what it is. And this can be referred to as a drama of disenchantment. Ordinary people learning about life through reality checks. And this process makes them interesting and understandable to us as readers. Now, the technical term for this process of disillusion is parody. Characters live with some kind of illusion, as romance characters would, and then suffer the disillusion that corrects their vision and has them grow up. So something that they really truly believed at some point comes to be ridiculous during the story, and the character has to change perspective to be able to learn from it. Now, you remember a story that we talked about before was Evelina, or the history of a young lady's entrance into the world in 1778. And this example shows how long ago realism was being experimented with. This story is a good example because it is basically two stories in one, and one is a romance and one is a more realistic story. And the standard story is that our heroine lost her low-born mother in childbirth. She had an aristocratic father who didn't believe he was the father, so she was given to a minister to bring up. During the course of her coming out into society, when she is sort of mid-teenage years, she discovers people who were her blood relatives that she didn't know about. And they are low-born, boorish people, and they end up having so much life to them that they are way more interesting than Evelina is, and they steal the show of the story. They're ordinary people with ordinary lives, and she has to cope with it. So we watch her having to change her understanding of who she is by giving her head a shake and realizing that she's not some princess, but these are her people as she figures out how she's going to find herself a husband. Now, this kind of realism of an ordinary person with an ordinary story seeming interesting is the kind of realism that we have discovered in Alice Munro's Lives as Girls and Women, where she actually defines this kind of realism as the kind of realism that she's trying to create. And at the end of this, it's a linked short stories that was packaged as a novel. The protagonist, Del Jordan, is in her town of Jubilee, and she wants to be a writer. And she writes this kind of gothic romance where she takes one of the kids in her town, Bobby Sheriff, and turns him into being this overly dramatic character because he goes away for a while, presumably to an institution, and then comes back to town. And so she takes this and flies with it with her imagination. But then she, as the character, the realistic character in the story, she's walking down the sidewalk one day, and Bobby Sheriff comes out onto his porch and offers her to come in for tea. And she does, and in the course of discovering who he is as they chat, she realizes that the realistic story of Bobby Sheriff is way more interesting than her gothic recreation of him in the story that she was trying to write. So of course she's going to throw out all her gothic misunderstandings and illusions, and she's going to start writing a more realistic story. And I'll give you a couple of quotations that Munro has put into this realization of what Del wanted to do as a writer, because it is a very good explanation of what realism tries to do, this vein of realism tries to do. So here's the quotation. People's lives in Jubilee, as elsewhere, were dull, simple, amazing, and unfathomable. Deep caves paved with kitchen linoleum. That's a really interesting way of putting it, that you have this ordinary veneer of kitchen linoleum, but then you have these deep caves that are much more interesting and compelling to just ordinary people. And what she says she wants to do as a writer is this. What I wanted was every last thing, every layer of speech and thought, even smell, pothole, pain, crack, delusion, held still and held together, radiant, everlasting. And that's the end of that quotation. So you can see how she really polishes up the idea of the depths that can be plumbed in ordinary people. Now, remember, these people are not real, but the conventions of realism make them look that way. And it always, in writing, involves the choice of what to represent. So it's never real life. You could never, by definition, smush real life onto a page. So you're going to have the intervention of a writer to select things and put them together and accomplish something on the page. So we don't ever want to mistake realism for the real, but we want to recognize how realism gives us that impression And telling the personal history of a character who seems plausible and actually changes over time is the first road of how writers got to realism. And the second road was a focus on human consciousness, and that will be the subject of my next webinar.